Hello Tech Pros, episode 161. Welcome to the podcast where I chat with professionals who are getting the job done using technology 7 days a week. Each week we start with Motivation Monday. Tuesday is about productivity, Wednesday, leadership, Thursday, technology, Friday, people and communication, Saturday, entrepreneurship, and Sunday, being unplugged. All right, let's get started. Hello Tech Pros, this is Chad Bostic, and I'm excited to be here Sunday Unplugged to continue talking about a subject that's super fun for me when I like and I finally take the time to get unplugged, and that's playing role-playing games. Now, I kind of screwed up episode 147. I started going down the role-playing game path, but I turned it into a top 10 business lessons that I've learned from playing role-playing games, which I think was good content, but a bad day to publish it. It's because that episode was really more about business and had nothing to do with getting unplugged and having fun and just enjoying life. What it was, okay, now that I've done this being unplugged, in the past I've been unplugged and I've played these games and I've actually learned a lot of things about business, about people, about relationships, about communication and facilitation. And I talked all about that in great detail on episode 147. So you can go to hellotechpros.com/147 to hear that episode. And then last week, I came back and said, you know what, that was a little bit of overkill on the business side. Let's talk about actually getting a group of people together to play these games, to get involved. And I was answering my nephew's question, or I started to answer my nephew's question about how to play a game, how to get a group together that's lasting, right? That lasts 3 or 4 years in this campaign, instead of just a group that gets together for a couple of times over a month or over a couple of weeks and that group falls apart. So the advice I give to Jacob, the advice I gave to you last week on episode 154 was really about finding a group that's appropriate for your role-playing game. So I went into a lot of detail in that episode about how to look at two types of people, the people that you already know in your life and the people that you don't know in your life, and how both of them might be appropriate for this role-playing game that you've got in mind. And so both of those have some pros and cons and some do's and don'ts. So how to work with the people that you already know, how to go out and find, a really good tip is find people that you don't know and start playing games with them, and then bring them together and make sure that all the goals and everyone's schedules are in alignment before you start playing. So now, after you've done that, so you've gone to hellotechpros.com/154, you've listened to that episode 154 on finding a group for your RPG, and so now you've played some board games together. You've got a group going where every Saturday you're meeting, or every other Tuesday evening you're getting together and you're eating pizza and you're drinking Mountain Dew and you're having a great time and everybody's laughing and joking and playing board games and enjoying. And you're like, okay, now we want to step it up. Now that we have this core group that's really active and engaged and involved and want to do more, what happened with us was this group that I was talking about with Jacob, my nephew, and that group of players who stuck around for 4 years. What happened was we started by playing board games. We started by playing the board game The Legend of Drizzt and the Shadows of Ashardalon, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Castle Ravenloft. And we were playing these games over and over, and my nephews just got addicted to it. My brother-in-law thought it was amazing. I had another couple of friends that were there, and we were having a great time. And then one of the nephews said, wouldn't it be awesome if instead of just having 2 levels, right, I start on level 1 in my character, and then by the end of the night, I'll level up to level 2. Wouldn't it be awesome if they had expansion packs so we could level up to level 3, and level 4, and level 5, and just have all kinds of amazing skills, and like the fighter could just get uber buff and just destroy anybody with one single punch, and the wizard could come up with all kinds of just amazing spells and basically turn into Gandalf and just totally destroy all the foes. And then the foes get stronger and harder and more difficult. Wouldn't that be so much fun? And I'm like, yeah, that would be fun, and that's called Dungeons and Dragons. So if you want to play something beyond the scope of this tabletop game, beyond the scope of a 45-minute session, gaming session, then let's talk about playing actual Dungeons and Dragons. And they were like, okay, That sounds a little dorky. I'm not sure what that is because all I've heard is kind of a little stigma in the press and at school and in society, right? Which is that's for the uber geeks and nerds. And I'm not sure I am there yet. I'm not sure I want to go there. So tell me a little more. I was like, well, okay. It's a lot like the board games that we're playing, but instead of having the rules baked in to the engine, baked into the cards that you're flipping over, you have abilities, same as your characters here. You have goals, the same as the characters here, but it's much more open format game. Kind of like the difference between, let's say, Mario Brothers, where there are certain actions and tasks that you're going to do in a side-scroller action-adventure video game, right, where you can only move left and right and up and down and collect the coins on the board, and then an open world format game, like a World of Warcraft or something like that, where you're just running all over the planet, all over the earth. You got so many different quests that you could take, and it's really up to you as the individual player to decide where you want to go and what you want to do. That's the difference. And they were like, wow, that sounds amazing. And then one of the nephews says, how long does it take to do that? And I said, well, that's how it depends on how long you can keep the group together. The one that I was currently reading, the adventure that I was currently looking at, I said, you start at level 1 and you go to level 30. And at the end of level 30, then you are basically a deity. You're basically a god. You have like Hercules, you have achieved so many things in your life and defeated so many monsters and dragons and zombies and everything else that you have achieved like a lower deity status, and you are imbued with so much magical power that you together, the 3 or 4 or 5 people or whoever that have these characters at the end that reach level 30 are basically like they're superheroes, like super superheroes. And you start the game as a hero status, and now you're like uber superheroes at the end of it. Basically, you're all gods. And they were like, oh my lord, that sounds amazing. We have to play. Can you put that together? And so we played and we played and we played. And 4 years later, we had just an amazing like mental scrapbook of all of these favorite scenes, all of these favorite fights, all of these favorite dramatic moments and characterization moments. And that's so much fun. So that particular game that we played was Dungeons and Dragons. It was D&D 4th edition. So now, at the time of this posting, we're up to 5th edition or whatever. They change the rules all the time. But I wanted to take this opportunity on this episode to talk about the different genres in role-playing games and the different systems that you can play, and when you want to pick each ones, or why you want to pick each ones, or do you even want to pick those, or do you want to homebrew something and build your own? So there's a lot of different options available. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, and there's no right and wrong. It's whatever you have fun doing. Whatever's fun for you as the game master, whatever's fun for the players at your table, whatever your group, your gaming group enjoys, that's awesome. Do it. But if you're not familiar with it, if you've only heard of Dungeons and Dragons, or you've only heard of Pathfinder, or you've only heard of one of these other ones, I just want to give you a little bit broader experience, broader knowledge, more information about some of these, so that you can maybe hear about some of them and go, you know what, that sounds interesting. I've never heard of that. I'm going to go research it, and I'm going to do some deep dives. I'm just going to provide the highlight reel. The only ones that I can give kind of any level of detail on are the ones that I've played very heavily. I've kind of might have played an episode or two, a session or two on several of these, but I'm no expert in them. Probably a lot of them have been 10 years or more since I've played them, and when a decade passed, I don't remember. I do not remember the details of how it all works and what the right, quote-unquote, right characters are, the best way to handle it. So if you have questions on those, I may not be able to answer them, except for the genres, except for the campaign, what do I want to say, the role-playing game scenarios and modules that I've actually used recently. Those are the ones I can talk on. in a lot of detail, but we'll be able to hit the highlight reel. We'll be able to hit like a broad view of different types of games so that you can go offline off of this episode and do some more research on the ones that sound like a lot of fun for you. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about RPG genres. Before we get into a particular system, like what system are we going to use, like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, before we make that decision, let's talk about genres. Okay, so I've mentioned high fantasy a few times. So when I say fantasy, I mean fantastical world, fantastical creatures, right? There's magical creatures. It is in a world where it's not normal. That fantasy setting is, think of like Lord of the Rings. Think of, if you know any of the books from the Forgotten Realms, those Drizzt series that I talked about last week, or the Shannara series. I don't know, just all these kind of fantasy where there's might and magic, there's sword play, and there's magic. And so the difference between these, when I say high fantasy versus low fantasy, is really kind of like the level of magic, right? So a high fantasy means there's a high level of magic in this world. It's very common. Like you have wizards and witches and spells and magical artifacts and magical implements and rituals and all this kind of stuff. And the world itself is used to having magical stuff in it, and the characters are usually very proficient. At least one or two of the characters at the table are very proficient in magical, otherworldly devices and or spells and or whatever to accomplish certain goals, right? So fireballs and magic missiles and things to manipulate earth and wind and fire, and things that can manipulate sound and music and thoughts, and things that can manipulate, the properties of some physical item, things that can allow you to speak to the dead, to raise the dead back to the living, necromancy, right? Think of all that kind of stuff. That is high fantasy, or that can be, some of that stuff can be in high fantasy, as opposed to more the low fantasy. The way I think about that is like more Game of Thrones, right? Where now that we're in season, what are we in, 6 or 7 or wherever we're at now, it's like there's starting to be a lot of magical stuff, right? Crap is going down with the dragons. The dragons are huge. There's Melisandre, the red lady, the Red Witch, right, that's doing all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to do any spoilers here. I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't seen the show. But when it started, when you think back, if you haven't watched Game of Thrones, there's magical stuff now, but when you go back to seasons 1 or 2, there was not much, or there's not any. And when they talked about magic, when the characters in that series talked about magic, it was like, oh, that was a long time ago. That doesn't exist. All the magical things have died out. All the magical things was more of mythology within the universe, right? And so there's not much there. And so when the characters encounter something that is magical or appears magical or feels like magical, there's a lot of conflict there, because some people are very, very they have a lot of animosity towards that, because they think, hey, magical stuff is bad, power is bad, and we don't want that. Other people are like, heck yeah, give me some of that. I want some of those dragons, right? Because again, power and being able to have an edge over your competitors and so forth, and this is something desired upon. But most people in this world never encounter anything magical, right? They're not seeing dragons, they're not seeing demons, they're not seeing zombies, they're not seeing wizards who can cast spells and do amazing tricks of illusion. They don't see it. They're just normal common folk. But think of, it's almost like historical fiction, right? So historical European history or English history, right? Where you have knights and you have armor and horseback and jousting and all that kind of stuff. But there may be flavors of magical things at some point that people run into. And when you do, it's like, oh my gosh, that just happened. Like, I can't believe we just discovered this thing. And it could be a magical sword with magical properties. It could just be, telepathy or something like that. It could be, I don't know what it could be, but It depends on the genre, or depends on the game itself. It depends on the story. But the fact is, most people never see the magic or hear of the magic or believe in the magic. But when it comes up, it's a big deal. As opposed to high fantasy, magic is very common. It's like technology today, right? If you took our iPhones and our iPads and our computers and our cloud computing and all the information available to us on the internet and took it back to like 1916 as opposed to 2016, just took it back 100 years ago, they the people living back in that time would think that we were freaking wizards and magicians, right? Or if you took someone from that time period, 1916, and put them in a time machine and brought them to today, they would be completely out of their element because everything around us would look like magic compared to what they were used to. Everything's analog, everything's mechanical, everything is just do it by hand or do it yourself, or just is never been thought of, or can't get access to this information or whatever. So that's kind of the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. So some other genres that are available are contemporary. And contemporary could be a lot of different things. But specifically, I want to talk about like contemporary action adventure or contemporary espionage and military. I'm gonna kind of put all of these together. Wait, hang on. First, before we leave the fantasy, actually going to go back to the fantasy and talk about some of the types of games, some of the campaign settings or games, role-playing games that are in those genres, right? So in the fantasy genre, right, there's Dungeons and Dragons, which is probably the biggest that everybody's heard of, that everybody jokes about. But there's a lot of other ones that you might not have heard of, right? So how about Conan? So, you know, Conan the Barbarian from the comic books and from the movies and some of the TV shows, right? Well, Conan and Conan supplements, there are role-playing games. Dragonlance. Dragonlance is a novella series that have been around since the 70s or 80s, and that's a huge series that has its own role-playing game system. Some of these that I'm going to be talking about are in print. Some of these are out of print. I can't keep up with what's available, but you know what? You can always find them on Craigslist or eBay or something like that. So this stuff is out there. EverQuest, there's actually a pencil and paper version of the old school online role-playing game EverQuest. There are role-playing games for Game of Thrones, right? So we mentioned Game of Thrones movies and A Song of Ice and Fire novels, but there's a Game of Thrones role-playing game where you can be some of the characters in that show or in that book, or characters that are in the world while all of the actions in those things are going on. I mean, any big fantasy movie or book series that you can think of, there's probably a role-playing game for it. So there's Lord of the Rings. There's probably 2 or 3 different Lord of the Rings and Hobbit-based role-playing games out there. Some of the others that are really big are, what was I going to say? They are, Pathfinder. Pathfinder is a really, really big one that's kind of very complementary to Dungeons and Dragons, very, very similar to Dungeons and Dragons. Kind of had a different publisher, different start, but you have the same type of things available. Some people call Pathfinder like D&D old school. So before D&D or Wizards of the Coast started changing some of the mechanics and some of the options within the game, Pathfinder is kind of a kickback to the old school way that we used to play D&D back in the 80s and early 90s before things started changing. So there's a lot of different... there's so many. I would say that fantasy is probably the biggest, meaning the biggest number of players and also the most number of different types of systems to play with. So there's a ton of so go check them out. Castles and Crusades, The Burning Wheel, Battle Dragons. I mean, I'm just looking right here on Wikipedia, and there's just millions of them that I've never ever heard of. Middle Earth, right? That's another one that's from the Tolkien series. Myth World, never heard of it. RuneQuest, sounds familiar. Oh, Mongoose Publishing. I've heard of that one, but never played it. Stormbringer, several different series in the Stormbringer Tunnels and Trolls, Warcraft, Warhammer is a really, really huge one. The Wheel of Time role-playing game, if you've ever read the Wheel of Time novels, I have not yet, but I will soon. So there's one for every page of every literature that you can think of on the fantasy side. Okay, so now we talked about, or I mentioned briefly, the contemporary, the action adventure. But first, let's take a quick break and thank our sponsors. This episode of Hello Tech Pros is sponsored by Hello Tech Pros. Want to be a guest on the show? Chad Bostic here, and I'm helping professionals who work with technology build a personal brand and get connected to an audience of thousands of technologists, entrepreneurs, business leaders, and investors. Download my cheat sheet of interview questions and apply to be a guest today by texting Hello Podcast to 44222 or visit hellotechpros.com/guest. Once again, text Hello Podcast with no space in the middle to 44222 or visit hellotechpros.com/guest. Are you new to podcasting? Are you looking for a fast, high-quality, yet budget-friendly podcast production team? Let Transource Media take care of you. With a team of professional audio and video editors, writers, and graphic artists, they can help you build your podcast from planning, post-production, and platform submission. Using only cutting-edge software and studio equipment, they're here to make each and every show sound at its best. To get a free quote, please visit www.transourcemedia.com or send them an email at marketing@transourcemedia.com or call them at 209-505-5693. Transource Media, transforming businesses through the power of multimedia. Okay, we're back here talking about role-playing games, systems of role-playing games, and genres of role-playing games. If you hear me munching and cracking on something, I've got a throat lozenge, so my throat is getting really sore today. I've recorded several episodes, and there's just a lot of junk. So we're back to school. So as soon as the kids go back to school, man, it's just like all the nasty stuff, the viruses and whatnot are going around. So I've been really struggling with this lately. So I'm just going to have a little throat lozenge here. Hopefully it allows me to keep talking, but is not too distracting. So apologize for anything that sounds weird or funky. Okay, so we talked about all the different, hundreds and hundreds of different fantasy role-playing game systems within that genre and the different types of kind of sub-genres underneath fantasy. Now let's talk about contemporary action, adventure, espionage, military. So when you think of this, think of James Bond, right? So he's kind of that action-adventure hero. He's going out trying to save the world. He might have some technology. He might have, some of the actions in there might be combat-oriented, or he's trying to beat up the bad guys with hand-to-hand combat or with guns or laser beams or, bombs made out of a wristwatch or whatever. So that is an example. Think of other action and adventure movies, and you're on the right track, right? So Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, right? These kind of shoot-'em-up action movies. I'm blanking out. The Mission Impossible series, right? Is that kind of espionage series. If you think of military, think of like any of the Tom Clancy books. If you're familiar with Tom Clancy, so excuse me, the Jack Ryan series, The Hunt for Red October, Clear and Present Danger, Patriot Games, these types of things where it's either one guy or a group of people who are out to save the world and going to be these heroes, or it's larger scale battles with like hundreds of tanks and fleets of aircraft carriers and so forth. But this contemporary action adventure, espionage military genre is really in that space. So it's not about magic. It's not about necessarily historical. There's some that kind of cross over a little bit into historical fiction. So there's a lot around World War II, World War I, some of the other periods in our past where it's not that fantasy, where it's not horses and knights and swords. It's more of guns and bombs and airplanes and stuff like that. But as we progress year after year, right, the latest and greatest contemporary means that all the other stuff is more historical. So now even if you're playing when I was growing up, when I was a kid, if you talked about the kind of more modern historical military games would be like from the Vietnam era, right? So you'd have F-4 airplanes, you'd have the aircraft carriers out there off of the Bay of, gosh, I just blew it. I can't think of my geography out there. But then in the Vietnam area, all of the different campaigns that were happening at that time, and then all of the what if scenarios, right? What if Russia back in the day got involved really, really heavy into the Vietnam conflict? What if America expanded into other areas that they were fighting? And what if this turned into a bigger global war? Or what if, the bad guys invaded our land, wherever our land is, where you work or live? And so that's kind of more historical, contemporary historical, if that makes any sense at all. Like I said, I've got a cold, so it may not make any sense. Historical action adventure, let's say that, versus contemporary action adventure is more modern. So even historical today could be more like the Persian Gulf 1 or Persian Gulf 2 scenarios, right? Where you had the Abrams tanks and the Republican Guard, and now we've got all the crap that's in Afghanistan and everywhere else in the world. I don't know. To me, that's too much like real world stuff that's going on, and so I prefer either crazy action adventure espionage that's kind of like goofy, campy kind of stuff like 007, or I prefer more the historical, like a long time ago, or I prefer fantasy and sci-fi. The modern contemporary stuff, like on the military side, is not my jam anymore. When I was a little kid, when I was like 13, 14, oh dude, I was all over it because I wanted to be a fighter pilot and I wanted to, be that great American hero, that G.I. Joe that flew airplanes and took out the bad guys. And now I don't want to play role-playing games in that area because there's just too much on the news. I know too much about what's going on, or I don't know enough about what's going on, or whatever. Anyway, that genre is pretty huge. It's pretty big. It's not as big as fantasy, but it's pretty big. And there's lots of different systems that you can play with. So one of the biggest ones from the same people who made, not Lord of the Rings, I almost said Lord of the Rings, from the same people that made Dungeons & Dragons, or the same people who publish and produce Dungeons & Dragons, the company called Wizards of the Coast, they also produce a system called D20 Modern. And if you're not familiar with role-playing games and dice and any of that stuff, there's usually a package of dice that comes with each one of these systems, or that you buy to play with each one of these systems, and there are certain different dice for different events that represent the randomness of the world, right? So I'm going to swing my sword at the bad guy or shoot my laser beam at the bad guy, and I might hit and I might miss, and some of that is due to my skill at shooting or his skill at dodging, and a lot of it has to do with luck too. So we're going to roll a dice and see, what luck has to say in this engagement. And so there are 6-sided dice, which is like you normally use in Monopoly and the Game of Life and stuff like that. And well, I guess not Game of Life; it's got that little spinner. But anyway, Monopoly and every other freaking board game that you can think of that has a 6-sided dice, right? But then there's 4-sided dice, 8-sided dice, 10-sided dice, 12-sided dice, 20-sided dice, and there's a lot more weird ones that you never see. But a 4, a 6, an 8, a 10, a 12, and a 20. Those are very, very common. You see those in all of these different systems, or a lot of these different systems. And so D20 means that they're using the 20-sided dice for the primary action things, right? To resolve combat, to resolve some sort of skill challenge, skill check. So it uses the D20 Modern uses a lot of the same mechanics as some of the older Dungeons & Dragons games used, or some of the Pathfinder games use, only that instead of swords and magic and fireballs and goblins and monsters and demons and dragons and whatnot, you've got tanks and airplanes and 60 caliber machine guns and whatever. You got that kind of stuff. So that's D20 Modern. James Bond, I mentioned him. He's got a big one. There's one that's called Spycraft that I've only played once, but it was really fun. Had the potential to be really fun. Unfortunately, we didn't get a group to stick around long enough, but it's kind of that that Mission Impossible kind of spy versus spy side. There's Top Secret, which is another one of those espionage type adventure games. Twilight 2000, Leverage from think of like the Leverage television show. Some of the ninjas, like modern day ninja stuff. So Night of the Ninja, and Super Spies. I haven't played any of these, but there's a ton of them available. Dogtown, haven't ever played that one. So there's a lot here in this genre. So contemporary action, adventure, military, and then fantasy. We've talked on it quite a bit. And then the historical time period. So I talked about kind of the Vietnam area and the World War I, World War II area. But if you also think of things that are historical or period adventure games like Indiana Jones, right? So it's not really an action adventure. It's more like a relic hunting, kind of dungeon delving, because a lot of what Indiana Jones does, he goes down into like these dungeons and in these buried tombs, and he's searching for buried treasure. Same kind of stuff that you have in Dungeons and Dragons, only he's got a bullwhip and his pistol and his wits and a sidekick or whatever. And so that, but it's in that historical World War II setting, but it's not necessarily about fighting the Nazis in many cases. It's about finding the artifacts or saving the person who's trapped in this tomb, or proving that this ancient artifact comes from this place rather than this other. So that's that historical period. There's also, there's tons of, think of anything maybe those medieval things, but not fantasy. So think of Vikings, right? But take out all the mythology stuff. If you take out all the mythology about Thor and whatnot, because that would kind of fall more into the fantasy realm. But take out all of that stuff and just use it strictly from a historical perspective of, okay, you got these raiders. They're very good at shipbuilding. They eat things like fish and lamprey and stuff from the coastlines. And so, and these are the different areas of the world that they attack or they raid or they defend themselves from. But it's not from that... it's not from the perspective of fantasy. It's not from the perspective of mythology. It's just about the history of actual people, like from the anthropological, about the old school. It's about what we know of the actual old school people that were here, and not the bigger than life mythological characters that we think of. A couple of other quick ones. Horror. Horror is a huge role-playing game genre. So there's a lot of different things here. If you think of like the Cthulhu series, which can kind of be fantasy, it can kind of be science fiction, but it really falls into this category of horror, these occult things. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is kind of a campy, kind of humorous comedy version of a horror, right? But it's about, werewolves and vampires and things that either in the modern day or in the past, but it's more about the kind of the occult and the like the vampires and werewolves and changelings and demons and stuff like that in the Victorian age, or in the 50s age with like the Cthulhu, the 30s or 40s age with the Cthulhu stuff, or modern day horror movies. I'm sure there might be a Twilight fan or two out there, right? But it's more of that kind of stuff. And so to me, horror kind of bleeds over into some fantasy. It bleeds over into some historical It's really kind of like, to me, it's like a subversion of fantasy or subversion of historical fantasy or contemporary fantasy, and I don't know, it's not my thing, but whatever. There's a lot of people that love it. Oh, zombie games! I love me some zombie games, so I guess I do like some horror games. So think of The Walking Dead, right? That would be in the horror genre space. So there are a ton of different games. And then, of course, there's science fiction, right? We didn't talk about Star Wars, but Star Wars, Star Trek, freaking Buck Rogers. There's a Buck Rogers game out there for all you big Buck Rogers fan. Any of the steampunk or cyberpunk games, like Ex Machina and a Gamma World, which is a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, but it's really more like a combination of all the historical things, all the fantasy things, and all the futuristic sci-fi things kind of merged together into this post-apocalyptic world where you can have a person riding a Tyrannosaurus Rex fighting a person that's strapped up with all kinds of laser guns, fighting a person who casts fireballs and magic missiles. So it's just kind of a weird mashup of a lot of different things. Let's see what else in the science fiction space. Mech. There's a lot of different mech games where you're basically a driver inside like a 30, 40 foot tall robot, and you're running around trying to, blow each other's robots and mechs up. There are Rifts. Rifts is a huge lot, very popular post-apocalyptic game in that science fiction genre. There's so many different Star Wars and Star Trek games. It's like each one of those could have its own series. There are their own series of podcasts. There's individual podcasts dedicated or podcast shows dedicated to each one of these Star Wars and Star Trek role-playing game series out there. So there's just a ton of stuff that's available. There's also superhero. So think of your DC universe and your Marvel universe. There are those, and then there are also systems that allow you to build your own superhero universe, right? And your own superhero skills and super villains and whatnot. So there's a lot of different options here. And then, of course, the multi-genre and the crossover genres, right? Like I talked about Cthulhu, which could kind of fit into multiple of these things. It's really, when you get down to it, it's about having fun. So what's fun to you? What kind of movies do you like? What kind of books do you like? Do the same thing, ask the same question to your players, to the people who are going to be playing these games with you. So before you just say, let's play D&D, let's talk about the things that we love, right? If everybody is just an absolute fanatic Indiana Jones fan, maybe there's a huge group of people that love Indiana Jones, and there's a huge group of subset of people who love Cthulhu. Maybe you need like an Indiana Jones Cthulhu crossover game, right? Or at least go into one or the other and then pull some stories or some inspiration from one of those games into yours. Now, what we don't really have time today is to talk about how to homebrew. Let's say you don't want to pick one of these. You don't want to play Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or Warhammer, but you do want to do a high fantasy, but you want to have your own, you don't want to homebrew it. That's a huge topic in and of itself. So we're going to have to save that for another time. So now you found the right group. You've kind of decided on a genre that you want to play that everybody agrees. And maybe let's go ahead and just pick one of these systems that we want to play with. I'll pick D&D to use an example for next week because it's very, very popular and a lot of people play it. And so next week, let's come back and talk about, okay, now how are we going to actually pick the game that we're going to play, meaning the characters and the people and the world and what's going to happen in this game going forward. There's a lot of planning that has to go into the Game Master experience, the Game Master side of putting this game together. There's a lot of thought, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of creativity that needs to go into this, but that will be not tomorrow's episode. That will be next week's episode. So come back next week to talk about that. Tomorrow we'll be talking about motivation and get back into our regular series throughout the week. Motivation Monday, Productivity Tuesday. But next week, come back on Sunday, being Unplugged, to talk about how to figure out like the plot and the story for your role-playing game. And until next time, take care. The show notes page for this episode can be found at hellotechpros.com/161. Do you use Slack for team communication? Join the Hello Tech Pros Slack channel at hellotechpros.com/Slack. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, subscribe to this channel, and check back tomorrow. This has been Sunday being Unplugged, but tomorrow my featured guest and I will get fired up and ready to face the week with Motivation Monday. On Tuesday, we'll be discussing productivity, Wednesday, leadership, Thursday, technology, Friday, people and communication, Saturday, entrepreneurship, and back again on Sunday to get unplugged. And I'll talk to you tomorrow.